Okay, good morning from Washington, D.C. Good evening to many of you in India and elsewhere around the world. Welcome to this webinar from ORF on Tech Wars, the Liberal Order, and the Rise of China. My name is Dhruva Jaishankar. I'm director of the U.S. initiative at the Observer Research Foundation, based in Washington. And I'm joined for the next hour by two really excellent speakers to discuss this topic, both based in the U.S. First, we have Jim Lu, Vice President and Director of the Technology Policy Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Before joining CSIS, Jim worked at the Department of State and Commerce as a Foreign Service Officer and as a member of the Senior Executive Service. He's the author of Cybersecurity for the 44th Presidency, Rapporteur for the United Nations successful 2010, 2013, and 2015 Group of Government Experts on Information Security. And he's led a long-running Track 2 dialogue on cybersecurity with the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, CICIR, KICIR. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago. Also joining us today is Elsa Kania. Elsa is a PhD student at Harvard University's Department of Government and Adjunct Senior Fellow at the Center for New American Security and Research Fellow with the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University. Her prior professional experience includes time with FireEye, the Department of Defense Long-Term Strategy Group, and the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Her research focuses on Chinese military innovation and emerging technologies, and she maintains a professional proficiency in Mandarin. So it's really great to have Jim and Elsa with us for the next hour. I'm going to be just asking them a number of questions, trying to cover the sort of range of issues that in some ways is a very timely topic that we have. It comes just weeks after India has issued a ban for apps based in China, including most significantly ByteDance's TikTok, which is now being under discussion actually just this very week in the United States as well. So it comes at a very at a really timely moment. I'm going to start off by just asking both Jim and Elsa to kind of lay the basis for this discussion. There's a lot of talk before we get into the specifics about China and international competition over this issue. There's a lot of talk about emerging technologies being in some ways game changers of various kinds, and these range from a number of automotive technologies to 5G telecommunications, to artificial intelligence and machine learning, to quantum computing, and a whole range of other issues. So maybe let's start off with Jim and turn to Elsa after that. Could you start off by just laying the basis? You know, a few years ago we were talking about technology being the great globalizer, the something that would connect people for different, across borders. Today we increasingly talk about it as a realm of international competition. So can you explain to us some of the changes that are underway, particularly on the technological side?
Thank you, and good morning to everyone, or good evening as the case may be. So we have seen a couple things going on that suggest a new and more turbulent period. When we think about the growth of the internet, it's come at the moment when there's a confluence of two trends. The first is the recognition of that perhaps the weakly governed model of internet governance developed in the 1990s may not be adequate anymore. That's a debate point. I think it's more adequate than people think. The second issue, of course, is the decline of the post-1945 world order, which makes it more difficult for people to achieve consensus. And the one thing we've learned that is perhaps a little unexpected is that some of the traditional or more conventional forces that we see in societies around the world have proven to be really powerful in the face of the new technology. Meaning we thought it was globalizing, we thought it would be, and the further back you go, the more powerful these ideas are, that we were moving to one world, it was the end of history, the start of a place where everything would be market democracies governed by the rule of law. And that's been overwhelmed by a reaction to globalization, by the decline of some Western ideals, or the identification of them as Western ideals, not as universal ideals, by the growth of populism. and by powerful desire for people to preserve their own culture. And so these forces, which you could roughly describe, I think, as populism and sovereignty, are reshaping cyberspace, reshaping the internet. We are now, in a way that we weren't some years ago, all conscious of the role that technology plays. And technology is not something new. I mean, for me, when I hear people complaining about artificial intelligence, you know, it's just another phase in the process of automation that began in the 17th century, right? So we're at a long trend of automation. There's different things here that involve, and it's more intrusive in a way. The more interesting part to me is not that quantum will have this effect or artificial intelligence will have this effect. If you want to do a fun thought exercise at home, every time you read artificial intelligence, take it out and put in software, right? And see if the sentence still makes sense. This is, you know, we're talking about, I think, an evolutionary change, but there are some discontinuities, and those are more important to me. And the discontinuity that's perhaps most important for me, is the political and social effect of the internet, which has helped create these trends or accelerate these trends of anti-globalization, populism, a desire to reassert one's national culture. And this is true in countries around the world. So a very different era. Technology plays a role in this, and we have a hard time figuring out what to do with that, because we're at the moment when the ideas that have existed for all 70 years are now being questioned, being challenged by powerful authoritarian states. I don't think they have a good replacement. I mean, that's one of the dilemmas for China, is that the Chinese ideal replacement for the evil Western hegemon is that we should recognize that China as the Middle Kingdom and the Communist Party has a historic role to lead the world forward. I'm not sure that will sell in many markets outside of China. I'm not even sure it sells in China, but of course people can't say no. So we're at a period of challenge and of change that is a conceptual one in many ways. We don't have the concepts to deal with these issues. And so that's, I think, one of our tasks here today and in our work moving forward, is how do we help redefine the concepts that underpin a just world, a reasonable society, and the use of these new technologies and their immense political effect. So I'll stop there. Was that long enough? Do you want me to go longer? I think that's plenty. Thank you.
So I mean, that's really interesting. You see this as an evolutionary process. It's less the technology, it's more the politics of the technology that has changed dramatically there. Elsa, can I turn to you? I mean, there are a number of things I did not touch upon that you've been focusing on a little bit, I believe, including biotechnology. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Sure. So first of all, good morning or good evening, everyone. And thank you for the invitation. Really glad to be joining the conversation, because it's certainly a really turbulent moment when it comes to how we think about the way technology is reshaping geopolitics. And the dimension of that has most captivated my attention over the past couple of years has been how technology is factoring into US-China rivalry in what American strategy is characterized as an era of great power competition. And I think we've certainly seen, just in headlines over the past couple of weeks, among many great powers of the US and China, China and India, how technology and the contest over innovation and over who will build and control technologies shaping our economies, our societies, and our militaries really coming to the forefront. And I am old enough to remember when there was intense skepticism in Washington that China could innovate, and how every week there is intense alarm about one Chinese technology company or another, and one realm of emerging technology or another. And I think to some degree, we've seen this confluence of geopolitics with fear and often hype over new technologies that to some degree is entirely justified, because we are seeing what has been characterized as the fourth industrial revolution, or what military strategists, including in China, are characterizing as the continuation of a revolution in military affairs. And we are seeing not just a single technology in isolation, but the convergences and intersections among a whole slew of really exciting fields. And of course, we've already mentioned artificial intelligence, quantum science and technology, fifth generation telecommunications, as well as biotechnology. And we're seeing really, when we think in historical perspective about the rise and fall of great powers, technology and command over new innovations has always been at the heart of that. And I'd argue that is a core element of China's grand strategy today. For instance, the National Strategy of Innovation-Driven Development that was launched back in 2016 was very, very explicit that China saw its past historical backwardness as a result of its failure to keep pace with the critical technologies of those eras. And today, Chinese leaders believe that China's rise and progression towards national rejuvenation demands really being at the forefront of these new frontiers and this new paradigm of innovation-driven development that is really, I think, at the heart of how we should think about Chinese governance and economic development and military modernization today, and the confluences among these objectives. And of course, with the recent frictions between China and India and how that's played out in the realm of technology as well, we're seeing that for any great power, for any major military to really compete in and contest is at the core of how they are going to see their path to being successful in a competitive environment in which these technologies are not only the purview of nation states, but also empowering new actors, be that technology companies whose platforms are becoming a new domain for geopolitics, and as well as electoral interference and political influence campaigns, as we've seen to great effect, and also the risks that non-state actors, even teenage hackers, of course, as we saw with the recent hack of Twitter, can cause great disruption. So I think this is definitely a moment where there is great uncertainty, and I don't have too many hot takes on the news beyond I think it's going to continue to be interesting and quite turbulent through the fall. And I think, certainly this raises a lot of questions, both about how to respond to what is arguably a absolute breakdown of the prior status quo ante US-China relations and the impact of these trends on the rest of the world, as well as what lessons we should draw from some of these issues we're seeing to understand the more systemic challenges that will lie ahead, for which democracies are still struggling, as Jim had mentioned, to come up with coherent solutions and alternative frameworks beyond a model of internet governance and a much more hands-off approach to managing these technologies is starting to show some of its downsides as well. So I'll stop there for now, and looking forward to continuing the conversation to see if we can figure this all out in the course of the morning or evening.
You touched upon something there. I mean, in some ways, this is a technological competition, as you both pointed out. On the other hand, it seems to be a competition over innovation systems as well. Who can innovate faster? And particularly, it seems in a sort of post-coronavirus global economy, there will be a sort of race on between the US, China, and others as well to kind of develop, to set up a better innovation system. Could I ask you, maybe start with Elsa first and then Jim. So what is, there was this belief that a single party state, hierarchical system would not be very innovative. And this was a pretty common view about China 5-10 years ago. And today, again, you're seeing a whole range of applications coming out. How much do you think is due to, investments that China has made in intellectual property, in education, in R&D? And how much of it is due to other things like cyber espionage and technological espionage that has taken place? So let me start with Elsa, and then Jim, would love to get your thoughts too.
Sure. So I think I'd say all of the above to start. I think that China's party state's approach to technological development has been incredibly pragmatic when it comes to focusing at once on trying to build up and invest in indigenous capabilities, as well as trying to gain access through illicit and illicit means to foreign technologies that could be incorporated into China's national innovation ecosystem. And I think that that's sometimes framed as contradictory, that China is either a copycat or innovative, but I think actually we're seeing the two play out at once in different spheres, and we've also seen that copycatting for instance, a Chinese internet company starting off as sort of trying to clone American models, but can actually lead to more genuine innovation, where some of these same Chinese companies that were once derided as copycats are now becoming both not only competitive within China, but also quite competitive internationally and going global with the digital Silk Road and otherwise. So I think that the balance between innovation and absorption, so to speak, or more derivative development of technologies really varies from sector to sector. I try not to overgeneralize. And I think we're also seeing sort of a change to some degree, in the character of what's required for innovation when we talk about technologies that are more open or open sourced, like artificial intelligence, where there is easier diffusion to begin with, because so many of the tools, as Jim said, this all is fundamentally software at the end of the day. It's not magic. It's there's the software, and that depends upon the data which China can bring to bear. And so certainly some of the advantages of China's approach to innovation are emerging as the result of policies that actually, I would argue, have some antecedents in American history, even if we have sometimes forgotten how we got to where we are. And yes, I think certainly the focus on the role of the government as a catalyst for innovation is something that we can trace a certain amount of American success back to. The role of DARPA, for instance, robust investments in basic research that have paid off over time, including in biomedical innovation. And we've seen China really start to adopt aspects of that model in their quest to have a more innovation-driven development in their own right. And as you said, investments in basic research, concentrating on education, as well as the recruitment of talent with experience at top universities around the world. So we're seeing some of these factors, some of these underlying determinants of innovation starting to coalesce in certain fields, even as we're also seeing very active efforts, as the number of recent indictments of individuals acting on behalf of the Chinese government to access technology illicitly can demonstrate. And yeah, I think that it's, at this point, it is incredibly arrogant to say that China can't innovate, and yet certainly we are seeing this targeting of foreign technology reveal that there are still underlying weaknesses, including in semiconductors, including in aero engines, including some questions about the strength of Chinese research when it comes to biotechnology going forward as well, given how actively that sector has been targeted. And this is all playing out with very high stakes when we think about, for instance, the race to develop a vaccine for the coronavirus, and where both the US and China, as well as India, have some important capabilities and contributions, as well as companies and laboratories that are leading contenders in this endeavor. And I think what is tragic, but in some respects incredibly predictable, is that this quest to develop a vaccine that could be for the common good has instead become very, very much framed as a zero-sum game, and where Chinese hackers, for instance, have been targeting American companies involved in this important endeavor, including in my hometown of Cambridge, Mass. And we are definitely going to, sort of see these questions about competition and innovation and national comparative advantage remain really at the forefront of mind and of policy, as well as there's the question of how in the United States today do we grapple with ways in which we may be losing our edge in some respects, and start to rethink how we invest in innovation and how we invigorate our own innovation ecosystems.
Mm-hmm. Would you agree with that broad assessment that it's, that in this question about how much China is developing an innovation system that can rival the United States versus how much it is really dependent on other means of getting that technology? Where would you stand on that?
Well, I think Elsa did a great job sort of describing the environment. So I'll just add a few points. One thing we don't want to leave out is China's own domestic politics. She has political problems just like anyone else, and his answer has been to double down on nationalism, confrontation, the importance of the party, he carefully studied what happened to the Soviet Union and before taking office, and decided he doesn't want to be the Chinese Yeltsin or Gorbachev, which is nice. He doesn't look like them anyhow, so it's not going to be. He has hair. But I think that tends to be left out, is that China is not the image it portrays to the world of this unified, forward-moving, central. That's all baloney, right? So if you start with that, which I think Elsa touched on, you have to ask what's changed that's going to make it more difficult for China. The first thing is, and this is something that the Chinese will admit to privately, Chinese researchers, is China became an innovative power after decades of investment in science and technology, but also in a period of relative political openness. And now as we see that political space contracting under Xi for powerful reasons related to the survival of the party, what will that do to China's ability to innovate? Remains to be seen, but I'm not sure it's a good thing. China has, in some ways, by its more assertive or aggressive policies, led many countries to think, how do we begin closing off Chinese access to Western technology? The US leads in that, but others are following. There's a deep concern about, I was talking to a Swedish government official about a month ago who said, well, we know that the Chinese intent is to hollow out and displace our industries. So we're very worried about that. So China's rise, which I'd say until a decade ago, I don't know what Elsa thinks, until about a decade ago, people didn't care. And now it's created antibodies. I think the importance of espionage to China can't be underrated. China's built its industries on shrewd investment policies, on ample local talent, but also on massive theft of intellectual property. And as that closes down, again, part of this larger closing of the West to China, the Chinese will be at a disadvantage. The number of Chinese spies operating in the US is immense, but every day there are fewer of them because we're catching them and throwing them out, which is good, right? The game has changed in a way that is not helpful to China. It is two competing systems, one with a strong Leninist tinge, and all the other, it's Leninism with Chinese characteristics, which may not be a good thing. But the Chinese have created antibodies. The Chinese have created a political reaction, not just in the US, but in Europe, in other parts of Asia, in India. By coming out of the closet a little too early, Xi has led people to begin to think, whereas before it was like, oh, the Chinese, that's interesting. Even 7 years ago, 6 years ago, we were still talking to them about how could we work together to make sure the world was more governed stably and all this. The Chinese didn't want that. They rejected that. To be specific, Xi rejected it. Xi wants to be the Middle Kingdom. And I think that they've now created a two-party game, whereas before it was the Chinese did their thing and we ignored them. Now everyone's paying attention, and perhaps the best sign of this is industrial policy in the US, which 5 years ago you couldn't say industrial policy without being hooted out. How we come up with a new industrial policy, it won't be the 50s with DARPA and the national institutes. And there's good elements in there, but we need to rethink it. But you see Congress now willing to devote tiny sums of money to 5G, much larger sums of money to semiconductors in a way you didn't before. So China has ignited a competition in innovation systems that it may regret doing.
Jim, on that note, I mean, and I'll turn to Elsa in a second, but where are areas do you see that China, there's a lot of the projection of Chinese capability is obviously sometimes much greater than the reality, as you pointed out. But what are areas where you see that they are actually becoming world leaders or have taken the lead? Are there any?
Well, I defer to Elsa to some extent on this, But on 5G, it's all baloney. We've always done a good job, but it's depended heavily on the theft of technology. They are still reliant on the US for chips and software. These are places that the Chinese know they're vulnerable, and so they're putting investment in. On artificial intelligence, as Elsa said, it's math, it's open source, it's statistics. Not a lot. The chips aren't that sophisticated, so they might do okay. They wildly exaggerate their prowess, however. On quantum, they're behind, but I was talking to the head of Google's quantum lab a few months ago, and he basically said, you know, China's not our peer, but I look over my shoulder every night. So there's some strength there. Biotech, the issue is what happens when they're closed off from Western research and Western universities. You know, I took it as a sign that if you look at the money in China, the private money that's invested in biotech, it leaves China. It goes somewhere else. In fact, its preferred destination is the US. So the smart Chinese are not betting on China. And that's a worrisome indicator. In the military field, there's some niche areas where they're quite good, you know. But overall,
well,
you know, they're
fintech?
not here yet.
On fintech?
That's actually an interesting one. You see, the Chinese have made some acquisitions in Scandinavia. So I love WeChat and Alibaba. I don't use Alipay, but I do use WePay and WeChat. That's to Elsa's point about in some areas, those are clearly copies. The late lamented Lu Wei, who was the former head of the Internet Agency, once told me, if we had not blocked Google, there would be no Weibo or Alibaba. So it's this ability to not observe their WTO commitments, to block foreign competition, and to copy foreign business. And all that's going to be harder for the Chinese in the coming years.
Also, to your point, I mean, over to you. I mean, where do you see areas where China is ahead, and you know, where are they behind in other areas? How would you assess it?
So my first reaction would be, what do we mean by ahead, and what do we consider the most important metrics of success? And in some respects, quantity can start to have a quality of its own. And when we're talking about actual impact, I think sometimes the tendency, especially in the United States, is to focus about, well, who has the best technology, or who is at the cutting edge of the field. But I think there's a practice, and there's certainly great importance and consequence in that, to the extent that we can measure it in fields that are so diffuse. I mean, I characterize artificial intelligence as more of an umbrella. It's certainly not a single technique or technology. And I think it really depends on where we look and how we measure within these various disciplines and domains, and also how we value research relative to applications. Because I think one aspect of success in China certainly has been their digital economy, and how dynamic it has become, how integrated online and offline life has been, including in e-commerce and delivery, and some of the economic dividends that has yielded and may yield as their efforts to continue to build this up and really build much more of a smart cities and an economy that runs on 5G. And yeah, there is much overinflation and alarmism to a degree that can become incredibly unhelpful relative to actually evaluating the state of play in these fields. And some of that is driven by Chinese propaganda that sort of ties innovation to prestige and national rejuvenation on some fronts. And certainly there are motivations, as we heard in domestic politics, to really amp up and overinflate these advancements. But I do think that China has been relatively successful in really starting to introduce and leverage some of these applications in a much more forward-leaning and aggressive manner than we've seen in the United States. And sort of a perhaps too expansive an overgeneralization would be that the attitude about AI in China seems to be, this is exciting, whereas in the US, we're afraid killer robots are coming to steal our jobs. And I think that is a significant difference when it comes to attitudes and the adoption of these technologies, and sort of China is, for instance, leveraging AI, starting to do so more extensively within education and healthcare, whereas there are more structural impediments to doing so within the United States. And yeah, I think that sort of the question of which metrics matter and will be of greatest consequence, yeah, sort of depends on the purpose of the question. And if we're thinking about, for instance, the trajectories of the American and Chinese economies, the ability of the Chinese economy to adapt and leverage and deploy these technologies may be in some respects more important than whether a Chinese company or laboratory is ahead of their American counterpart in any given field. That being said, I do think that the aspirations of Chinese leaders are clear to be a leading nation in innovation in the years to come, and to really ramp up investment in basic research. And of course, the results and returns on investment continue to be quite uneven. And I think it remains to be seen sometimes where different trajectories for the US and China will lead. So for instance, China may not be ahead in quantum in general, but in quantum cryptography and communications, there's been much greater concern and attention to deploying this, to build up a national network that leverages it, and to launching the world's first quantum satellite, and plans for more quantum satellites in the years to come, integrated with ground stations and the capability to leverage quantum key distribution at greater distance. And of course, quantum could be a whole other conversation unto itself, that there continue to be debates on whether this is a viable approach or whether this will prove to be costly but wasteful and not yield major improvements in security relative to classical techniques and alternatives. But I think we are certainly seeing a willingness to invest heavily in a series of and set up new national laboratories, for instance, within the realm of AI, including for brain-inspired intelligence, and an interest in new techniques at the intersection of neuroscience and machine learning. And yeah, so I think that as an American, I worry sometimes that we vacillate between alarmism and complacency. And I think the level of concern or reaction, I think, really depends on looking more specifically at any one of these fields and starting to measure or recognize where Chinese research may have some strengths. For instance, in biotechnology, there's a fairly robust research in biomaterials and industrial applications potentially. And yeah, I think beyond the headlines, the landscape is incredibly complicated, and I think we shouldn't assume that we won't be surprised by Chinese companies or Chinese research, given the resources and the level of priority this has been afforded, up to the level of Xi Jinping himself.
Quantum's a good example in one way, because the fellow, I've talked to him, the fellow who came up with Messias, their quantum satellite, he studied and was trained in Germany, right? So what happens to China when they no longer are afforded the privilege of studying in the West?
But on that point, do you think it'll get to that? I mean, I know there have been some constraints in the United States, but do you think it'll get to a point where there will be those kinds of restrictions even in a place like Germany?
I think even the Germans are being caught by the discrepancy between China's statements and its behavior. So they were able for a while to ignore Xinjiang, which is surprising, but they are not ignoring Hong Kong. So China's behavior drives people away. We'll see what that does to access to universities, but the Germans are having a fierce internal debate over how much to let the Chinese in, or rather how much to put them out. So China's behavior has changed the attitudes of the world. And to Elsa's point, perhaps that will affect their ability to come up with new innovations in the future.
Yeah, there's a terrible irony here as well. I just wanted to add here too that we've seen this interesting confluence of innovation as national strategy with the attitude under Xi that the party leads everything, including technology companies. So there is ways in which we've seen this policy and ideological agenda overplayed, especially with regard to contradiction between Chinese companies that are trying to go global and become international competitors, but the role of the party and the actions of the party, including some of these human rights abuses and crimes against humanity, by all evidence, are proving incredibly self-defeating, whether that's for Chinese AI companies that have been involved in building surveillance systems in Xinjiang, or how there have been allegations and some indications that TikTok is censoring and its counterpart in China, ByteDance, across its platforms, are censoring any content from Uyghurs or in their language or related to that appalling situation. And yeah, and certainly the sort of contradiction between sort of claims and rhetoric that China is committed to world peace and global cooperation relative to some of this more assertive and aggressive behavior around the world, including in the recent border conflict with India, and which I have heard remains an interesting situation and may for some quite some time to come, given the ongoing standoff in some respects within that region. I think we are seeing this backlash, and we are seeing ways in which the party's policies and priority are at odds with its stated objectives to have China be integral to globalization and global governance while leveraging the full benefits of a world that has been more open to China.
Elsa, on that note, we've been talking mostly about the civilian realm, but how much do you think, I mean, I know you follow the military side quite closely. How much do you think this competition over technology and on innovation is going to affect the military balance generally between the United States and China?
It will be incredibly important on that front in the years to come. But again, I think our understanding of the impact depends upon how we think about the timeframes of relevance. And also, I think we're in a moment where it is to some degree an open question which capabilities will be most critical in the years to come, and how to differentiate between actual impact relative to perhaps irrational exuberance. And certainly the US and Chinese militaries are similarly enthused about the potential of AI across various applications. I think increasingly, I would tend to argue this will be important, but more incremental in its impacts, given that there is quite some distance between the notion that AI could transform warfare as we know it, which I think is a trend and dynamic we'll see playing out for decades to come, and sort of the shift from an era of information technology to an era in which big data, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, all of these start to come together and become more integrated into battle networks. I think this is a critical feature of modern military rivalry, but at the same time, for militaries to actually develop weapon systems that have, and information systems in general for military purposes beyond weapons, that have the safety, security, and reliability to function effectively, I think is going to remain a challenge on many fronts. And yeah, the increased complexity of the operational environment also raises challenges in terms of talent and training, and being able to recruit officers and enlisted personnel who are capable of being effective within the kind of environment. So I think that the Chinese military, in line with Chinese strategy overall, is concentrating on innovation, is quite focused on emerging technologies, and we are starting to see some of those dividends play out. For anyone who is watching the Chinese military parade, I guess this was 2020 has flown by. I guess this was back October or so 2019, which was
seemed like
nearly
an age
a year ago now already. But yeah, seeing all of the drones that were displayed, all of the potential advances in nuclear capabilities that enhance Chinese deterrence, many more of these indigenous than had played out in prior parades. So I think, certainly the Chinese military is signaling and brandishing these kinds of capabilities, but there is quite a distance between a parade relative to the battlefield, and the PLA is a force that in many respects is untested, with the exception of some of these territorial engagements in more recent history. So I think that Chinese leaders are turning to emerging technologies in the military realm in the hope of achieving an advantage relative to the United States. And much of this sort of initially centered around US attempts to craft the third offset strategy, and Chinese military concerns about being left behind if they failed to keep pace with experimenting and starting to leverage some of the same emerging technologies. But I think, yeah, and this is still at a fairly nascent stage when it comes to sort of how some of these new technologies will start to impact the military balance in more tangible ways.
You know, what I'd worry about, though, is more US capabilities. So if you look just at the Indo-Pacific region, we've had 2 collisions, eminently preventable. An aircraft carrier withdrawn from service because of COVID, along with its escort, which was withdrawn for its companion carrier, withdrawn for engine trouble. They won't be redeployed until 2021. That's like an 8-month delay. We had the helicopter carrier fire in San Diego that raged for days. Our missiles are outranged by the Chinese. We've got a huge bet on the F-35, which is probably not a good idea because it's predisposed on the question of will stealth survive, you know, as a useful military technology. Quantum fits into that. Short answer is no. You can expect stealth to be less valuable by the end of the decade. We have the difficulty of coming up with responses to China's island building. So I think the US is exhausted by 18 years of fruitless wars, and we will need to rebuild. And when I look at some of these things, I recognize the pattern from earlier wars. You know, we're in a position where we're going to have to rebuild, and that worries me far more than any gadget that the Chinese can come up with.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Conventional capabilities still have their significance, especially when it comes to U.S. efforts to maintain presence within these disputed waters, and ways in which the U.S. military, I think, is starting to have to reckon with its own challenges, and the costs and consequences of conflict, I think, is certainly a feature that will remain a really critical concern in the near term. And I think there's also reasons for concern insofar as some of these collisions and accidents and close encounters between the US and Chinese navies in the South China Sea do raise, I think, really, really grave risks when it comes to, given the state of play in US-China relations, if there were to be an incident, are there mechanisms in place to manage that or enable de-escalation, or could we see, certainly I think, I hope we are not on the verge of an actual kinetic conflict, but I think certainly the risk of an accident and further confrontation is shouldn't be ignored, especially given all the other turbulence recently.
No, we're on the verge. The Chinese don't want to negotiate. So, I mean, we aren't going to get a mechanism because they don't want a mechanism. So I think until there's a little bump of cars, we're going to continue down a dangerous path.
A couple of questions from viewers, including my colleague Manoj Joshi. I'll direct them at Jim first, and also if you want to jump in, feel free to. The first one, we haven't really discussed the sort of energy space very much and innovations in that space, and particularly things like electric vehicles, but sort of the energy transition that everyone seems to be under at this moment. But Jim, in your view, is where is China moving in that direction? Maybe I'll ask that first, then a follow-up question.
Well, again, it's the Chinese have put immense resources. They tend to pick winners, which is one of the criticisms people take into concern when thinking of American industrial policies. They've picked the electric vehicle sector as a potential winner. The last time they picked it didn't work out so well, but maybe this time will be different. So yes, I think they'll do quite well. I was amazed to see Elon Musk announcing he would set up a Tesla plant in Shanghai. It's like, why not just give them your stuff, dude? But it gets back to some of the questions we've been discussing. You've seen Chinese espionage in an effort to steal battery technology. You've seen Chinese policy to extract electric vehicle information from the Germans and from others. So a major focus for them. On the larger climate question, I don't know. I don't have a good sense. Maybe Elsa does. If the Chinese have had a conversion experience, they're building more coal-powered plants. That's not what you'd call a green solution to energy. They do have something of a nuclear program, but the coal power plants investments continue to go up. So in some areas, they will do well. In other areas, they will not, because they, I think at the end of the day, they're not looking at this through the prism of how do we meet our global climate commitments. They're looking at it through the prism of how do we best achieve Chinese dominance in global markets.
And I would prefer that quantity has a quality of its own when it comes to the degree to which China has scaled up production of renewable energy, and certainly the capacity to achieve a advantage, at least in terms of cost. It does enable Chinese companies and producers to establish a more central position within global markets. So I think, especially in comparison to the United States, where we've seen investments dwindling in some respects when it comes to new energy and renewable alternatives. I think in the long term, I mean, the crisis that looms over us, and the headlines of the day will be climate change. And I think that on one hand, it's encouraging and heartening to see Chinese investments within renewable energy and green technology across the board. And I hope that we'll see a greater restoration of some global cooperation on this end as well, though I think there is this contradiction between the urgency of this crisis relative to the national interests in geopolitics that continue to undermine more collaborative solutions, which is profoundly discouraging.
And another question for start with Jim again. We've seen the United States already tighten export controls against China, or the Department of Commerce has already taken some steps in that direction. Quite detailed, in terms of what technologies that'll be factored into, and anything that potentially has dual use, essentially. My colleague Manoj Joshi asks, are we likely to see a general ban on exporting technologies related to the entire range of the Made in China 2025 scheme? Is that something that is on the cards for the United States?
We're certainly moving in that direction. I don't think you'll see a complete ban. US companies don't want that. They're very concerned about China, and the change in the corporate sector's attitudes towards China is one of China's greatest mistakes. Is they had powerful voices supporting them in the US who now no longer do that. But these companies still don't want a complete ban. It will take time to disentangle the two supply chains. It won't be that easy, but the course has been set. The US has changed course. More concerning for the Chinese would be that Japan and the European Union are also changing course. In some ways, the Japanese are ahead of us when it comes to restricting access for China. The Europeans are certainly moving in that direction. I had a commissioner tell me, I think Elsa has heard me say this late last year, that the Europeans were on the same path as us, just 2 or 3 years behind. So China's behavior has provoked concerns about technology transfer because of the illicit means it uses to acquire it. Because once they get the technology, they do not live up to their WTO commitments. So I think the words that will shape the environment and shape export controls are reciprocity. What do we see on the Chinese side? Very hard for them to make concessions. And increasing closure. People will look for, it won't be a blanket. There may be some in the White House tempted to do a kind of a blanket embargo, which we haven't had against a country in perhaps 40 or 50 years, other than tiny ones. But there will be continued restriction, particularly as Xi moves in the direction. Elsa knows more about this civil-military fusion than me. It's like, who cares? Because I've always been a bit suspicious of some end users in China. Many now share that suspicion as Xi moves to militarize and marshal Chinese industrial resources for national purposes. The concern will grow and the desire to impose new restrictions will grow. So, but think of it as incremental and piecemeal.
We have about a little over 5 minutes left. I really enjoyed this wide-ranging discussion. I want to end on one, if both of you could put on your hats as policymakers. We have let's say you have a we'll have an election at the end of this year, despite some attempts to suggest delaying it. But there will be a U.S. presidential election at the end of this year. You will have a president take office in January, either Donald Trump or Joe Biden. If you could suggest 3 or 4 things for the incoming administration to prioritize when it comes to technological competition with China, what would be some of those things that you would highlight? Maybe start with Elsa.
Sure. So I think increasingly, and forgive me if I sound like a broken record on this front these days, my overriding alarm is the fact that we have this focus on competition, at least rhetorically, by the current administration at the expense of resolving unbelievably urgent challenges at home. And as an American and as someone who is also concentrating professionally in US-China relations, I am alarmed by the current trajectory insofar as the failure to constrain the pandemic, the depths of the economic crisis we're going to see playing out in the months and years to come, to talk about rivalry in the abstract without being able to sustain the most fundamental elements of our governance, of our systems across the board, including in healthcare, education, state of our infrastructure. No matter how much I sort of focus on aspects of U.S. foreign policy and national security, I keep coming back to what I think is a reality that we cannot divorce these concerns of foreign policy or national security strategy from the state of our house, from the state of the US economy, our society, some of the fractures we've seen, which are very amenable to exploitation by potential adversaries that can use these fissures as a means of sowing division through interference in information operations. And I think across the board for any of the technologies or any of the strategic challenges we can discuss, a lot of it does come back to just the fundamentals of what made America great in the first place, and trying to recover and trying to recognize candidly the extent of the current crisis and the systemic and structural changes that will be necessary going forward, whether that is trying to reinvigorate our democracy and ensure the viability of our democratic institutions, which have been under great strain in recent years, including core principles like freedom of the press and First Amendment activities like protesting that are integral to our character as a democracy. I think if this is a competition between the models and systems that the US and China bring to the table, I think that I always start by emphasizing above all else that we have to concentrate on the resilience of our own democracy and its capability to adapt to challenges, whether that is education or a more effective and equitable healthcare system or otherwise. And of course, there are all sorts of countermeasures we can take and talk about, be that investment screening, export controls, improved scrutiny to ensure research integrity at American universities. But I think that the fundamentally underlying all of that is America's trajectory as a nation and whether we are preparing and positioning ourselves to thrive and compete on the world stage going forward.
But I mean, if I can just press you a little bit on that. I mean, let's say, President Joe Biden comes in January, waves the magic wand, the economy sort of bounces back better than expected, coronavirus is swiftly dealt with. In the next few years, what would be things you would like to see the United States do? I mean, let us say it gets its act together at home. What are the things that you would like to see the United States do to make itself, prepare itself more for technological competition? Well, should it be focusing on specific sectors? Should it be focusing on innovation and R&D side, or on applications? Does it require government spending, or should it be private sector driven? I mean, I guess that's where I'd want to press you a little bit.
Yeah, I guess I'll just add that I think sustaining investments in basic research, I think, is the most critical element of the US government's role in this, and investing in technologies that we may not anticipate could be transformative. And I think that's one of the things that can be dangerous about some of the cycles of hype around the so-called race for 5G or race in AI, that there can be a lot of interest and capital generated sort of based on the buzz, and in that process more important investments in long-term research that may not have the same headlines or the same hype in industry, and may be neglected. So I think investing in research and really concentrating on rebuilding our system for STEM education and expanding that pipeline, I think are critical. And again, as I said, some of these policies are not about China. If the US could resolve all of our domestic challenges, that would be wonderful. And I think that also, in some respects, would be a prerequisite for coordinating and collaborating more effectively with other democracies in ways that, for instance, can counter the CCP's attempts to promulgate their values for emerging technologies, and as well as coordination on constraining tech transfer. And I think creating a united front of democracy, so to speak, I think is a critical element of US policy and strategy in general, and for grappling with the challenges of emerging technologies in particular. And I hope we can see greater engagement and coordination with our allies and partners around the world as well, beyond that. And I think all of us as democracies are grappling with the challenges that these technologies raise and the disruption. And I think that the next couple of years and decades will remain quite interesting on all of these issues.
Jim, over to you, and I think you'll have the last word on this as well, because we're running short of time. But over to you.
Sure. So I'll be quick. A couple points. First, so you asked what should a good strategy? Three that we might want to think of. The first is to engage allies and like-minded nations in some sort of coalition with common interests in managing the China problem. That incipient coexistence exists when you go to Brussels or Tokyo. So we need to work with our allies. Having negotiated with the Chinese, I can tell you they respond much better. When it's just the Americans showing up, they'll stall. But when it's Brussels, when it's Berlin, when it's Tokyo, they'll sit up and pay attention. I suppose I should add London and Ottawa to that list. Where does India fall in this? I don't know. There's a marriage of convenience between the US and India when it comes to China, but I wouldn't say that it's a very deep relationship, and that will take time to work out. We'll need to think of how India moves forward. Where does India fit in? India should be on the Security Council, but if India was on the Security Council, it might be even more dysfunctional. So we need to see how the trajectory of Indian policy goes. We need to engage China, not with the expectation of getting any consequences or results. The Chinese are not going to make concessions anytime soon. But prior to this administration, you had high-level discussion on a regular basis. The Secretary of State, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs or their deputies. We need to restart that process, to have a process, not to expect the Chinese to agree to anything. And the foolish mistake for the Biden administration would be to assume coming in, and Democrats tend to be in their first year from the do-gooder community. Oh, it's just a misunderstanding with the Chinese. Once we talk to them, we can work something out. Sure. We need to think up a range of consequences for Chinese behavior. China will not change absent compulsion, right? That's just the truth, having again negotiated with them for many years. If the Chinese see no penalty for misbehavior, they won't stop. On the final point, one thing that is a mistake to do, and it's a mistake the Soviets made and that Hitler made and that many have made since America became a world power, is to underestimate the ability of this country to reinvent itself. We're going through a messy period, but again, we've seen that in the 70s and in the 50s and in the 20s and 30s and in the 19th. This is a recurring generational problem for the US. And so there are systemic issues. We're the first democracy, please hold your applause, but that means we have a very clunky constitution and it will be very hard to fix. But if I was the Chinese, I would not assume that the changes they see in the US are permanent. Sure, for the next few years, it could be messy, but Think of the Soviets announcing in the mid 70s after Jimmy Carter that they had won and it was inevitable. Who was still on their feet 12 years later? So take a longer term view. One of the things and India has this as well. Europe has this as well. Democracies are messy, they're vibrant, but they can change and they can get better. And so the Constitution doesn't say that we are perfect. It says that we can pursue perfection. If I was the Chinese, I would be watching that. Where will the relative balance of power be 10 years from now? I'm not sure time is on their side.
Well, on that note, thank you both for really insightful comments, and that's a fascinating way to end the conversation as well. Thank you both for your time, and we had really good participation on this. It's good to see so many people on and so much interest in this topic. Thanks again, and look forward to having you at future Observer Research Foundation events. Thank you to all of you for staying on. Bye.
Thanks so much.
Great, thank you.
Take care and have a great day.
Good seeing you all.